Hey everybody, it's Olivia from the Tennessee Conservative here to bring you this week's Big 7 update. We've got some good bills, we've got some bad bills, and we've even got some things that are kind of funky, so I'm excited to get into them. But before we dive in, I want to remind you, if you're not already, subscribe to our free daily e-newsletter. It's chock full of goodies, all the goings on around the state. You don't want to miss out. All you have to do is text NEWS, NEWS, to 423 205 5600. Again, text news to 423 205 5600, and you will be all signed up and getting that in your inbox every day. You don't want to miss out. And remember to follow us on all of our social media pages. We're on X, Truth, Getter, Gab, Rumble, MeWe, Parler, all the places. Anywhere there's social media, we're there. So be sure to check us out. Now, let's dive into the good stuff, shall we? First up, we've got Governor Lee signs a bill stripping local GOPs of caucus and convention rights. Now, despite uproar from local GOP groups, county chairs across the state, and private citizens, grassroots organizations, I know Tennessee Stands put out a big call to action on this one. Governor Bill Lee officially signed legislation into law that strips local political parties of their ability to hold caucuses or conventions in place of state-run primary elections when selecting their partisan candidates. Now, while most of the counties in Tennessee do go ahead and use a regular primary system, there are a few that don't. And political parties have the option on how they want to select their primary candidates for local offices like mayor, county commission, sheriff, etc. They can either do a primary election, which the county chair must call for during an election year, or they have the option to do a caucus or convention. But this legislation, sponsored by Representative Lee Reeves and Senator Jack Johnson, one of our favorite rhinos, mandates that any county political party use a regular state-run primary election to select those local party candidates. So under this law, counties that used another method besides the primary during either 2022 or 2024, they're grandfathered in. So we had a few counties, like I said, smaller counties that do use those alternate methods to select their candidates. They can continue to use that method for now, but if they ever decide that they want to do anything different, their only option moving forward is a state-run primary. And other counties will never have the choice to go back to a convention or to try a convention if they wanted to do that in lieu of a primary, which they already do. So it really strips county parties and the GOP as a whole of the choice of how we select our candidates. So it's a bit crazy that the state would think they have the right to tell us how we select the candidates that we want to run for office. So there was a lot of uproar about this, particularly amongst conservative and grassroots, which went basically ignored and often rebuked in the committee process. There was some shocking displays by several representatives and senators. Todd Gardenhire was one of them, who literally tore into the newly elected Williamson County GOP chair for his testimony in opposition to this bill, which is totally within his rights, and he was making some fantastic arguments. Steve Hickey, who was that newly elected GOP chair, actually called the legislation an assault on the autonomy of private political organizations. Everyone who opposed this bill cited several Supreme Court cases which have already ruled in favor of autonomy for political parties. The state GOP executive committee actually passed a resolution calling the bill a betrayal of trust. And if you have any idea about what goes on with the state executive committee, you'll know that it's a big deal to get them really in unison on anything, let alone something like this that pushes back against GOP leadership. So this was a big deal. But it went into law anyway. And not only did it go into law, but it went into law suddenly out of the blue. An $8 million budget amendment was proposed to cover the costs for these counties who don't use the primaries. And this was very disappointing because some of our conservative legislators and the American people, the Tennessee people, were flat out lied to, because I believe it was Monty Fritz who several times in the committee process, and there were others, but he's the one I remember, specifically asked if there was a fiscal note attached to this bill, and he was told point blank, no, there wasn't. But instead, the legislators' leadership lied and decided to pull $8 million from the Duck River Fund to fund their basically retribution bill for losing the local GOP elections in Williamson County. So very disappointing. Governor Lee signed the bill into law Thursday, April 24th, which he could have said, hey, I don't support this, which he's been known to do. He hasn't vetoed anything. He's never used his veto power, but he could have said, I don't approve of this, and let the law pass into become official without his signature, but he did sign it, which is really a way to show his support. So very disappointing on that one. But on the other hand, a piece of good news, we have a new Tennessee law which will help shield gun manufacturers from weaponized lawsuits. So the bill is still waiting its signature from Governor Lee, but it better will protect gun makers and sellers from frivolous or politically weaponized lawsuits. So this was House Bill 873 and Senate Bill 1360, which shields firearms, ammunition, and other weapons manufacturers and sellers from lawsuits over the criminal misuse of their products by a third party. So basically, this means that any of these providers or makers or sellers cannot be subject to a politically targeted or weaponized lawsuit if it attempts to hold them responsible for someone who uses their product to commit a crime. So a bad guy gets a gun and commits a crime, and everybody wants to sue Smith & Wesson because they made the gun. That doesn't even make sense, right? But it happens, and that's why this law became necessary. Now, in alignment with the Federal Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act of 2005, current Tennessee law already stipulates that these manufacturers and distributors may only be sued if it can be proved their product directly caused harm. Like if they sold a faulty product or they willingly sold to someone knowing they had a criminal intent. But the House Bill 873 expands on these protections in a couple ways. So firstly, it now adds protections to include additional industry players like private sellers, suppressor manufacturers, and magazine producers. So we're broadening the umbrella of who falls under these protections, which is awesome. It also prohibits Tennessee courts from recognizing or enforcing out-of-state or foreign court judgments that conflict with Tennessee's pro-Second Amendment policy. Now, this part is going to be really helpful in protecting our manufacturers from suits like one that's currently before the Supreme Court. Mexico is suing United States gun manufacturers because they're trying to blame them for the rise of cartel-related violence. Make it make sense. I don't even know. The fact that it's all the way to the Supreme Court blows my mind. If I were Clarence Thomas, I'd be laughing, as I said, absolutely not. But we'll see how that turns out. But this expansion of the protection law will help stop those cases from even being brought in the future. So that's good. And finally, it penalizes bad faith litigation by imposing triple damages on an out-of-state plaintiff and their attorneys who attempt to enforce hostile judgments in Tennessee courts. So if they try and file one of these politically targeted lawsuits, they could be slapped with triple the fines and attorney's fees that the plaintiff has to pay to the manufacturers. So that's a really good disincentivizer for these targeted lawsuits. So that's a really, really strong bill. It was carried by Representative Monty Fritz in the House, where it passed 72-20. We did have one Republican, John Gillespie, who voted most of the House Democrats in voting against. So that's interesting. Call yourself a Republican and then don't vote for things that protect our constitutional rights. Senator Joey Hensley carried it in the Senate, where it passed 26-6, right along party lines. Not surprising, all the Democrats voted against it. But ultimately, this expansion of protections for gun manufacturers like Beretta, Smith & Wesson, and there are a few others who moved already to Tennessee, will prove that the state is a safe haven for lawful firearms commerce. So that's exciting. We want more gun manufacturers here, right? The more the better. Next, another piece of good news. We have the Medical Ethics Defense Act becomes law, allowing healthcare professionals to refuse to offer treatments in conflict with their conscience. Last week, Governor Bill Lee signed the Medical Ethics Defense Act into law, which applies to healthcare professionals within the state, including doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and even insurance companies, which will allow them to refuse to pay for or perform a procedure or write a prescription that violates their conscience. So this is going to be really huge for protecting religious liberty, especially for these providers having to be forced to perform certain procedures or comply with certain policies within their companies that directly violate their deeply held religious, ethical, moral beliefs, etc. So for the purposes of the legislation, conscience of an individual is defined as the sincerely held ethical, moral, or religious beliefs or principles held by that healthcare provider. So again, you don't have to give an excuse of, religious beliefs. It's simply, this is on my conscience. So we saw so much of that being violated during the COVID era. This is a great protection not only for patients because they can have confidence their doctors are following their conscience and ethics and morals, not what their companies are telling them to do. And it obviously protects those providers and enshrines their constitutional rights as well, right? Very important. In regard to institutional entities or corporate bodies, the term is determined by reference to that entity's or body's governing documents, including ethical, moral, religious guidelines, directive, mission statements, constitutions, articles of incorporation, bylaws, policies, regulations, all that jazz. And this kind of came, one testimony that really stood out during the committee process was Tennessee-based OB-GYN Dr. Jonathan Shaw, who testified in support, and he shared that he was almost pushed out of his practice but up in the Northeast because he refused to comply with a policy that went against his personal beliefs, which mandated that he had to announce his pronouns to patients. So he did not agree or participate in that ideology and was almost forced out of his practice, which, again, for what? It doesn't change his ability to be a good doctor, and we're mandating all sorts of constitutional violations in order for you to keep your job, which of course is wrong. So according to the Alliance Defending Freedom, which supported the legislation, 8 other states have previously adopted conscience clause laws that have barely been utilized and never been challenged in courts. So that's a really great one. Secure things in there, not likely to be challenged in a court, but is going to provide some excellent protections for both patients and providers. So that's exciting. This is a great bill. A little bit on the flip side here, Automotive manufacturer closes 2 Tennessee locations, 400 plus jobs lost despite receiving multiple taxpayer-funded grants in recent years. Automotive seating manufacturer Adient has announced the permanent closure of its facilities in Maury and Henderson County, subjecting over 400 employees to layoffs. That is very unfortunate. We hate to hear anyone losing their job, particularly American workers. That's never a good thing. 95 employees are expected to be let go at the Maury County facility, where layoffs started April 17th, and the Henderson County facility began their layoffs April 21st, where 320 employees are expected to be let go. Again, very unfortunate, but interesting. This is where it gets a little bit, I think, questionable, not of course for the workers, but makes me question what was really going on maybe behind closed doors, because the closures and the layoffs come despite the company's acceptance of 3 taxpayer-funded fast-track grants in the last 6 years. So 1 every 2 years, give or take, they're getting taxpayer subsidy, basically, and still can't afford to stay in business. Interesting. The most recent fast-track grant received by Adient was $155,000 in January of 2024 for expansion purposes in Rutherford County. So they got a grant, they're doing so well, they need to expand, and yet here we are a little over 2 years, no, not even 1 year later, and suddenly we're having to permanently close the facility. So I think raises some questions there for me about what's going on behind closed doors, like I said. The company also received a $90,000 grant for expansion in Maury County in April of 2019 and over a $2.5 million grant for expansion in Henderson County in April of 2018. So expanding, and then boom, all of a sudden we're completely closed. Fishy, if you ask me. Numbers projected for the expansion monies at the time the grants were issued showed 62 new jobs for Rutherford County, 90 new jobs for Maury County, and 216 new jobs for Henderson County. So what, we're losing more than that, equal or more now in these layoffs. So everything that was promised was created is being stripped away, plus potentially more. So that's very frustrating. The jobs created in both Maury and Henderson counties by these taxpayer-funded grants just a few years back will now be lost. Like I said, losing equal or more to the amount that supposedly was created, and they were basically, in essence, bailed out with these taxpayer grants, all for naught. And unfortunately, we know that those who suffer are, of course, the poor laid-off employees. So maybe lift them up in your prayers. We hope that they will find new work and get back on their feet very shortly.
Guys, do go to TennesseeConservativeNews.com, hit that support button. It is my intention, if we can cobble together some additional money, I would like to do subscriber acquisition campaigns, but they are expensive, they require setup, and you have to spend money. And if we can reach more people in Tennessee, and if more conservatives actually knew that their government was quite different than what it looks like right before Election Day when they get the campaign collateral, I think we would have a more conservative Tennessee. So go to TennesseeConservativeNews.com/support or mail your checks to P.O. Box 625, Signal Mountain, Tennessee 37377. That is P.O. Box 625, Signal Mountain, Tennessee 37377.
Next on our list, former Tennessee DCS caseworker turned teacher is placed on leave after allegedly restraining a 7-year-old with tape. This is a hot mess from top to bottom. This is crazy, right? A former caseworker for the Tennessee Department of Children's Services, who then turned to a first grade teacher, has been placed on leave after allegations that she inappropriately restrained a 7-year-old child at an Antioch, Tennessee elementary school. We're not off to a good start, I would say. The first grade student was taped to a chair at Mount View Elementary School. A spokesperson for MNPS said that Roan's administrative leave is in accordance with the district's policies and procedures to allow for an investigation and is standard operating practice for situations of this type involving employees. Interesting, right? They're going to conduct a nice little in-house investigation, I'm sure. Also, according to MNPS, the incident involving the teacher, Danielle Roan, took place Thursday, April 24, so very recently. She was previously employed by Department of Children's Services from November 2020 until March of 2022. So this is the person deciding whether or not you get to keep your children in your home, then decided that she wanted to teach the children and then tie them up. So this is some good hiring practices here in the state of Tennessee. Good vetting, right? Prior to her time as a caseworker, she worked as a case manager in Donaldson, Tennessee, supporting individuals with developmental disabilities, and before that, as an early childhood teacher. Once again, excellent vetting work. She even worked a short stint as a mental health counselor at a residential treatment center in Nashville. So I'm not sure if she forgot to take her own advice or what is going on there, but clearly not a person who should be around children. It disturbs me that this woman was in a position of somewhat authority to decide if parents get to teach their children or keep their children and what it looks like in the home. And then she decided to teach these children. I'm sure we can imagine the sorts of things she was trying to push onto these susceptible young minds, no doubt. More recently, Roan served on the National Board of Governors for the Human Rights Campaign, which is the largest LGBTQ political lobbying organization in the United States, as an outspoken advocate of trans ideology. So there you go. I should have read the last sentence because that made my point for me, didn't it? Not the kind of person who should be around children by any means. So we hope that investigation goes quickly. We obviously hope she will be permanently removed. And I obviously hope there are charges pressed because she's got to learn, right? America's entering into our FAFO stage, and I think Tennessee needs a little of that ourselves. So, speaking of people who should not be anywhere near children, we've got 2 Tennessee illegal aliens, one found guilty of strangling his girlfriend to death, another fatally stabs his wife outside of an elementary school. Yikes, just yikes. So the first, a Hamilton County jury convicted an illegal immigrant for the 2022 murder of his girlfriend. Jose Angel Rios Ramirez initially told police that he had gone to sleep next to his girlfriend, Olivia Joaquin Pena, after a night of drinking. Okay. He said he woke the next morning to find her unresponsive. You know, as we all do. We go to bed and boom, wake up next to a dead girlfriend. When Hamilton County EMS arrived on the scene, Pena was pronounced dead, and after additional questioning, Rios Ramirez told police that the couple had been arguing the night before. Ultimately, he stated he strangled Pena from behind until she stopped talking and then went to sleep beside her. Ew. Like, what do you even say to that? That's disgusting. Earlier in the week, the Tennessee Conservative reported that another illegal alien was arrested in Nashville for the stabbing death of his estranged wife at a local Madison elementary school. Candido Raul Rubio Perez was arrested by agents of the U.S. Marshal Service Task Force on April 17 because he allegedly killed his wife when she arrived for her job as a custodian at Chadwell Elementary School on April 12th. 2 issues here. Number one, why is, I'm guessing if he was an illegal, his estranged wife, I can't say for sure, but I'm guessing there's a high chance she's probably not in the country legally either. So you've got an illegal immigrant working in the schools. That's a problem. And then, secondly, obviously, it's a problem when somebody shows up on school grounds and murders someone. That's generally an issue as well. Her body was discovered in the school parking lot by another staff member before students arrived for the day. That is traumatizing, no doubt. Rubio Perez initially fled the scene, leaving police hunting for him, and after his arrest, he was booked into the Davidson County Jail on felony murder charges with no bond. Hopefully, that will lead to ICE picking him up sooner rather than later and getting him the heck out of our country. We do not need that garbage anywhere near us, particularly our children, right? And finally, this one I think is a little bit wacky. This is very interesting. The federal trial begins for a Bosnian man living in Chattanooga who is accused of war crimes. Super weird, kind of wonky thing going on here. So, the trial of a Bosnian national who's lived in Chattanooga for years began on April 30th, as the man has been accused of war crimes during the armed conflict between Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 1990s, or Herzegovina, excuse me, in the 1990s. So, just a couple years ago. So, I'm sure I'm going to butcher this name, but I think it's Said Milikovic. No, Milikovic is being charged by the government with 3 counts of torture and 3 counts of passport fraud. So the torture charges claim Milikovic severely mistreated prisoners of war when he served as a member of the OBL, which is a police force of the so-called Autonomous Province of Western Bosnia, the APZB, which was responsible for guarding APZB headquarters. So during this conflict, I believe this was under Clinton, and I believe this conflict had to do with the breaking up of the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia and all that, so there was territory and land grab and power voids and all that stuff. So he was in charge of guarding one faction's headquarters. Court documents also show that in 2007, Milikovic naturalized as a U.S. citizen under the false identity of Dukic. He changed his name to Dukic after 2 failed attempts at entering the country using his birth name, which obviously have culminated in the 3 passport fraud charges. So this guy's attorneys previously moved to have the charges dismissed, primarily claiming the statute of limitations has expired, but also that the U.S. government did not have jurisdiction over the case and violated due process. Now, I don't, this guy's a scumbag, no doubt. I'm confused why we're prosecuting a foreign national for crimes that he committed during a war that we had nothing to do with. I'm not saying the guy's not a scumbag, but it is a little bit weird to me that we're prosecuting him for torture for crimes that were not committed against Americans, really had nothing to do with us at the time, and now we're prosecuting him for human rights violations, which is, obviously human rights violations are bad and torturing is evil, evil, evil. But this is, to me, this is where it just gets a little wonky because it's kind of bizarre. 30-plus-year-old charges for torture against non-Americans that really had nothing to do with us. We weren't involved, with this particular guy or anything he was doing. So a little bit weird. But the motions were denied to dismiss by U.S. District Judge Charles Ashley Jr. During the trial's opening day, the prosecution's first witness, a childhood acquaintance and later a victim, recalled being abused by guards, including one instance where Milikovic made him bend over a chair before beating him with a metal pipe and then forced his head onto a bayonet blade. Awful. Piece of garbage. If convicted, he faces up to 20 years in prison for each count. Now, again, I have to say, while I'm fully supportive of going after the passport fraud charges, that's a big deal. That's a big no-no. I think, an interesting situation that may toe a weird line about what our responsibilities are internationally for war crimes and things like that. Because if this guy was a victim, I doubt he was living in America, so they probably flew him from Bosnia or former Bosnia and all that. So I think it's just a little bit bizarre to me. So moral of the story, we want this guy convicted as harshly as possible. Go to jail for the rest of your life. Bye-bye. Really shouldn't have been allowed in the country in the first place, which raises some questions, but that's a different situation. So all of that to say, my friends, that is your Big 7 for this week. Thank you so much, as always, for your support, for tuning in, for listening. If you want to help make a difference in Tennessee conservative reporting throughout the state, we sure would appreciate your support. Your treasure means the world to us. We're the small operation, but we are mighty, and every dollar makes a difference. So if you feel so inclined, We would be ever so grateful for any monetary support you could provide, because everything we do here is for the betterment of our state and our country. Thank you guys so much. We appreciate each and every single one of you. Have a fantastic weekend, and we will see you Monday with our brand new e-newsletter.